They told her rejection would be a wound that healed. They were wrong. Lena stood under the cold porch light, the dress she had worn to his family dinner folded into a bundle at her feet, and felt a small part of herself go quiet in a way that made every breath sound foreign. The street smelled of wet asphalt and crushed parsley from the market, a green sharpness that rubbed against the sour taste on her tongue. She had believed for years that Ben would always choose her, and when he turned away in front of his mother and her sister, it was as if the world had tilted and left her alone on an island she had not prepared for. It was not merely the end of a relationship. It felt like losing a map that had once helped her find home. That night, a sound came from the edge of the park, a drawn-out, low note that softened into a question. It was a voice that was not exactly human and not exactly wild. She thought then that the rejection had made a space inside her, that something older smelled and wanted to enter. The town of Harrow's Bend had a way of keeping its weather and its rumors close. Streets sloped toward the river like hands offering themselves, and the older houses leaned together as if for warmth. Lena lived above Noemi's bakery, where ovens never stopped breathing and the smell of yeast filled the mornings like a promise. Her life had been a small inventory of routines: morning coffee, answering emails at the conservation office where she cataloged old oak groves, texts from Ben that blurred into polite conversations that pretended not to be everything. Her circle was small and named: Maya, the woman who held the town council together with an almost maternal urgency; Jonah, the mechanic who kept his heart guarded behind grease and laughter; Claire, a schoolteacher who never missed birthdays; Matthew, an attorney with a tie for every mood; Isa Howard, the local historian whose files smelled of paper and time; and Officer Ruiz, who walked his beat with a scraper of patience. Each of them moved through Lena's life like chapters that kept her anchored, and, for the moment, equally implausible as rescue. She had loved Ben in the uncomplicated way of people who grow used to a shape and mistake habit for fate. He had a laugh that easily folded into the rest of anyone's day, and hands that remembered comfort like a manual. When he kissed her on the river bridge last spring, she believed herself found. But by the time the invitation arrived for that family dinner, something inside him had withdrawn like light behind glass. He apologized in a soft voice that was practiced and sharp. "I am sorry, Lena. I am choosing a different life." She had nodded, the word forgive lodged in her throat like a stone, and later, walking alone, had felt the night press its cool palm to her neck and whisper that the bruise would be deeper than she guessed. Behind that bruise was a family story that cast a longer shadow. Lena's grandmother had left the old country with a trunk of linens and a secret necklace that no one in the family spoke about. In the attic, among the trunks, Lena had once found a small journal with pressed leaves and an entry that described rights that bind and marks that remember. Her grandmother's handwriting was careful and had a tremor at the edges, as if memory itself had cost blood. Lena grew up on those half sentences, on a house that smelled of lemon cleaner and cinnamon, learning how to stitch seams and stitch stories to make them whole. She learned to listen for sounds at the edge of sleep and was rewarded by the way the world sometimes answered. That family legacy, a combination of pragmatic love and hushed myth, taught Lena to hold both skepticism and possibility at once. When the low note came from the park and the hair at the back of her neck rose in a way that felt like an immediate inheritance, she did not react with the sort of fear a stranger might. She turned toward the dark as if toward a door she had been trained to find. The first time she saw him, he was not quite a man, and not quite the thing the old histories described. He stood at the tree line, like someone pausing between two pages, his silhouette tall and ridiculous against the thin fog that pooled like breath near the ground. He smelled of rain on stone and wild thyme, of an animal that had been outdoors for a long time and was newly cleaned by the night. There was a white across his shoulders that might have been a jacket or might have been fur. His eyes in the borrowed lamplight were not quite human and not quite wild, but full of an intelligence that slid into Lena's chest and placed a hand where old grief was still raw. He did not move the way men did when they were afraid, nor the way animals did when aggressive. He tilted his head as if studying a painting he had seen before, and in that tilt something like recognition unfolded. Lena felt, embarrassingly, that her hands smelled like yeast and salt and worry, and she lifted them to the small beaten necklace at her throat that her grandmother had worn and that she now kept like a secret anchor. "Who are you?" Clara asked, when Lena tried, later, to describe the curve of his jaw and the color of his eyes. The word had felt too human at the moment. The man who stood in the tree line had answered first with a sound that was not a word. It had the long, low rhythm of a promise and of a challenge. In the week that came, Lena would learn the language of small signs. Dead birds arranged with eerie care, a narrow crescent carved into a tree near the riverbank, gifts left wrapped in bark and moss. Old Isa Howard would call them tokens and shiver while arranging newspaper clippings. "The pack marks," she would say, and tap the table as if earthly things might tremble on cue. Those marks meant something unfamiliar and dangerous to civil society, and something binding and ancient to the rules that wound the wilderness into order. They meant that Lena had been noticed. They meant that the loneliness she bore had been smelled and claimed as possibility. You could not speak of pack law in Harrow's Bend without bringing in the ledger of names and old grievances. The Alpha did not make decisions on whim. There were rights, votes, consults with elders, and the marking was both emotional and legal in their roles. The process of claiming involved a public ritual, a scent exchange, and finally a council signing that indicated the pack's consent. Items, such as a lock of hair or a token from the town, were held as evidence in an envelope with the Alpha seal. The legal underpinning was simple in practice and specific in language. Claim was only binding if witnessed by 3 pack members and recorded by the elder for lineage. Such procedures felt archaic to outsiders, but were how order persisted in a place where bloodlines braided with moon cycles. Lena discovered these rules when Officer Ruiz brought her to the town hall, his face pinched with the expression of a man reading a script he did not want to say out loud. He explained in precise terms the chain of custody for gifts marked as mate tokens and the penalties for breaking ritual. Lena listened with the light with which a person listens to a law that might save or destroy them. Her own personal backstory had not prepared her for being read like a book by eyes that both softened and sharpened. Lena's childhood was a small map of quiet corners. She learned to be observant because in a house of 3 women, speaking too loudly meant bumping into grief. Her mother had taught her how to wash wounds with water and how to fold clothes with a precision that made order out of worry. At mine, Lena had sat on the back steps with pliers and a packet of seeds and promised herself she would never be seen as fragile. School gave her a name on lists and a place in teams. She learned leadership by volunteering to organize the fall cleanup and feeling something fierce and right in making the town better. A series of summer jobs told her the value of labor and the feel of money earned in midday heat. Loss shaped her too. There was the afternoon when her father, whom she had admired quietly for his stubborn kindness, did not come home from. A shift because the river had taken him in a sudden swirl one winter. The grief rearranged Lena, compressed into a refusal to waste time, into a hunger to be useful. That utility brought her to the conservation office, where she cataloged maps and tree rings and, later, memories of the way land holds stories. These childhood and formative fragments were the bones on which the scene of rejection and then of claiming would hang like ornaments that were both beautiful and precarious. The Alpha's past was shorter on tenderness and longer on consequence. His name was Rowan. People uttered him with a mix of respect and caution, as if speaking the name might call the wind. Rowan had grown up on the western ridge, where winters were honest and people measured worth in the ability to endure. The earliest accounts Lena found in Isa Howard's files painted him as a boy who kept his face open, but his padding guarded. He had been trained by an older Alpha who believed strength was choosing to carry burdens rather than to wield them. Accounts varied. Some claimed he had once bartered his future to settle an old vendetta. Others said he had refused a claim in youth and paid with loneliness. Those stories threaded together into a central fact. Rowan bore responsibility the way some people bear scars. His leadership had been carved out of hard choices and late-night patrols, and people trusted him because he chose protection over glory. In town archives, he appeared in photographs taken on festival days, a steady presence at the edge of celebrations like a backbone that did not need applause. He was gruff in interviews and precise in ritual.
Lena, in meeting him, encountered the residue of that history in a man whose laughter arrived late and whose eyes were the color of old wood. Rowan's transformation from boy to alpha involved both violence and mercy. In the stories, a rival pack had once tested his borders and left a line of small tragedies. Rowan responded not with the ferocity his opponents expected, but with a strategy that cost him knights and blood and a compromise that saved many lives but left him isolated. People said he had lost a mate once, though the name never came clean from throats who knew the risk of resurrecting grief. The weight of those choices made him an object of rumor and myth. In private conversation with Matthew and Maya, Lena heard pieces she fitted together like shards. He had a code and a softness that he rarely let show, like a lantern hooded to keep it from being smashed. When he and Lena finally spoke after the first encounter in the park, his voice was low and measured, as if he calibrated every syllable against consequence. "Why are you here?" Lena asked in the moonlight, the words pulled dense with the hum of her heartbeat. Rowan cocked his head, and for a second looked offended
at the idea of needing to announce belonging. "Because you are not fine," he said. "Because the town makes a habit of losing what it cannot name." "You speak in riddles," she said, trying to make herself brace against the softness that crept into her chest when he inclined toward her. "I speak the truth," he replied. "You are marked, whether you know it or not. That mark does not ask for permission." "Marked by what?" Lena demanded. "By the fact that Ben left me? By the way my necklace sits?" "By scent and by choice," Rowan said. "By something older than Ben and kinder than the reasons people give for leaving." The conversation that night stretched into an exchange that felt like the first time two people learned to dance. There were 10 verbal steps between them, a rhythm of questions and guarded answers. Lena asked him about ritual, about the law that made mates more than affection. He answered in scenes: the council meeting, the elder with a ledger worn thin, the scent jar kept in the elder's chest. He told her that the pack did not insist on ownership, but on acknowledgement, that claims could save as much as they bound. Lena, for all her training in facts, found herself moved by the way he talked about accountability, as though it were a living thing. The town reacted with the curiosity of small places that know how to watch and how to whisper. Issa Howard clipped articles. Maya called Lena with a voice that tried to be steady and failed. "You need to be careful," she said. "Lena, the pack changes everything. They are not just legends for headlines." Jonah, when he saw Lena, touched her arm like a mechanic testing a machine for cracks. "You will be all right," he promised loudly, as if to convince himself. Claire brought tea and a stack of old children's books. "You always come back," she said, in that teacher's way that folded hope into instruction. Officer Ruiz disappeared into paperwork and returned with offers of escort and stern looks, as any good constable in a town with a history would do. Matthew read out loud from the municipal handbook about liability and public disturbance, and then closed the book like a man who had spoken the spell and wanted the world to resume. By now, tokens were appearing with a ritualistic calm. A fox pelt lay on Lena's doormat one morning, arranged with 2 smooth river stones placed like eyes. A note in careful handwriting read simply, "For keeping warm." Lena had always been a practical woman, but the arrangement struck her with a complicated tenderness. She took the pelt to Maya, who hummed and then called a meeting of the small circle in which they were to decide whether to be afraid or generous. "Gifts are not always kind," Issa Howard said, her fingers worrying a paperclip. "They can be warnings," Rowan countered. "Gifts can be protection," Rowan countered when he arrived to speak with the group in the back of the bakery, his presence filling the space like a throne that had not been requested. The conversation between him and the town was a long exchange in which positions were tested and hearts pressed. At one point, the dialogue shifted into a courtroom of wills. "If the pack claims," Matthew said, "what legal standing does the town have?" "The pack's rituals answer to themselves," Rowan said. "We do not ask permission, but we take responsibility." At roughly 1/3 into the nights that followed, with the first major revelation still wet on everyone's lips, the video-style urge required a pivot. If you are listening now and this moment clicked for you, then you know the double ache of being rejected and then observed. If a scene like this made your chest tighten, tell me in the comments which side you take. Tell me, starting with Team Ben or Team Rowan, who got your sympathy first? Share a memory of being chosen or left. Your words shape how we tell the next chapter here. We build these stories together because in them we find the threads of our own lives. Knowing which way you lean helps me decide which wounds to fold tenderly and which to set to delight. Now lean in, because things are about to move, and the town will not remain idle. The escalation was not dramatic at first. It was a pattern that tightened like a loop. Dead rabbits found at the edge of the schoolyard, arranged as if in apology. Footprints, large and narrow, that led nowhere but made the ground tell stories. A neighbor, Tom Ellis, found one morning with his dog gone and no explanation, left the town holding its breath. Rumors connected his absence to the pack in worried whispers. People who had previously dismissed legends now sat through long evenings at Noemi's bakery, speaking the old names with new respect. The pack marks, and then we have to answer, Isaac from the hardware store told Lena while he handed her a coil of rope, as if expecting she might need to bind something or someone. The idea of a predatory beast prowling did not match the kindness of the man who brought her rope. The contradiction sharpened everything. Tension rose to a legal and physical sense. The council held a meeting where Rowan stood and performed a scent exchange in public, an act that both signed him to Lena and informed the town that the pack would no longer be invisible. "This is consent and care," he said aloud. "It is not seizure." The scene drew murmurs. Claire wept quietly, hands folded in her lap. Officer Ruiz took notes with professional neatness. Matthew argued the civil implications to protect Lena and the town alike. "We will not be ruled by fear, but we will not ignore ritual," Maya said firmly. Votes were taken in private and public ways. But town's law and the pack's law met like two fences pushing at a shared field, and the result was always, maddeningly, compromise. A technical procedural description emerged when Lena asked for clarity. A recorded scent exchange required the elder to place a sachet of the signer and the claimed in a ledger envelope. Witnesses signed, and the elder flagged any conflicts in lineage on a ledger with a code. Violations were dealt with by restitution and ritual, often mediated by the Alpha and the elder, not just by civil courts. Lena watched as town procedure folded into ancient rule and felt both relief and queasiness. The catastrophe arrived out of the blue in the way small towns have tragedies that feel intimate because everyone knows the person who was hurt. On a rainy Thursday, a delivery truck clipped the front of a school bus. The air filled with the smell of diesel and frightened air, plastic and metal, and the tang of wet leather. Lena arrived to find Claire on the curb, her hands white around a thermos she did not remember holding. Children clutched backpacks, and the river of rain washed grit across the asphalt. In the chaos, a figure moved with preternatural calm, bending to lift a child as if gravity obeyed him differently. When Lena reached for the child, the man, whose eyes she had seen under the tree line, handed the small body to her and looked at her as if he were putting down something precious. His breath smelled of iron and grass. Later, leaned against the ambulance, Lena felt the world contract and then stretch out again. The accident had been a prism. It refracted the pack's presence into an act that saved, complicated, and claimed at once. She learned then that the beast had teeth and also hands that could pull someone from wreckage. One moment of tension she would carry for weeks was the argument before the claim was made public. It began civil and then flickered into the raw. "You cannot just walk into our lives and mark what we have not agreed to," Matthew said, voice taut. "We are a town with laws." Rowan answered with patience turned hard. "Your laws do not always save children," he said. "They can paper over truths until pain becomes routinized." "And you think you can be the one to decide the truth?" Matthew shot back. There were 4 more exchanges, each sharper than the last. Lena felt herself in the center of a tug-of-war. In a private vignette the next day, she confronted Ben at the bridge where they had kissed, wanting answers, and receiving instead a series of excuses that were both familiar and hollow. "I am sorry," he said. "I never meant to hurt you." "Then why leave?" she demanded. He looked at the river and said, "Because there is a safety in choosing a life that does not require burying old promises."
The phrase made Lena's stomach drop, as if she had swallowed cold water and could not breathe for a moment. That exchange reverberated and left her raw. The claiming scene itself is a final spiral. It happened under a moon that refused to be meek. The town gathered in a cleared field, people clustered like islands of light. Rowan stood at the center. The elder, a woman named Rowan had long called Elder Mara, moved with the slow certainty of someone used to handling tinder that could start a forest. Songs were sung in low tones that felt like the hum of a loom. Lena felt the scent of rosemary and smoked juniper in the air. She felt the weight of people's expectations and the press of history in every pair of eyes. There was a legal formality: 3 witnesses, the elder's ledger, the scent sachets pressed between palms, and a final signing by both parties. There was a physicality to the act that words failed to catch. Rowan touched her hand and the world narrowed to the contact. Pain, which had been Lena's companion since Ben's departure, braided with something like relief. Then the claimed band was placed, a natural material braided with a thread from Lena's grandmother's necklace. The place where the band touched her skin pulsed like a new memory being made. When claiming happens, there is a moment of fallout. Some people are relieved. Others feel betrayed. Ben came to the edge of the crowd that night, his face a yes and a no, and did not speak. He watched as Lena's life shifted into a different order and then walked away as if the sound of his own feet were heavy with regret. Claire embraced Lena after the ritual and smelled like rain and peppermint and something old that made Lena's ribs unclench. Jonah clapped Rowan on the shoulder and made a joke about needing to borrow tools for pack duties, and the crowd laughed with an energy that was equal parts relief and masking. Isa Howard pressed a note into Lena's hand that read, "Some marks are gifts, some are histories. Hold both." Officer Ruiz recorded the proceedings in the notebook he kept for events that did not easily fit police reports. The fight for acceptance with the pack erupted in a pack meeting that quickly tested the Alpha's resolve. Several younger males challenged Rowan, their voices dangerous under the night sky. "Why does a town decision matter?" one of them demanded. "Why does a human's past decide a bond?" The exchanges were many. Rowan answered with tenacity and with words that carried the weight of responsibility. "Because in this age, times change, and we must learn to protect more than bloodlines," he said. "Because the pack endures only when it takes care of those it claims." A challenge flared into a skirmish, and Lena watched as her new life demanded sacrifices she had not anticipated. The physical dangers were real. There were teeth and torn clothing, and a hand that reached and grazed Lena's hair in a way that made her feel exposed in a way she had not invited. She felt then both a claim that calmed and a claim that hurt. A later night gave rise to a moment of near death that changed everything. Lena had gone to the ridge alone to clear her head and walked into a trap meant for game but intended for people. A snare tightened around her ankle and she fell, breath stuttering like a cassette stuck on a loop. The snap of a twig announced presence, and a figure dropped down the slope with the speed of a shadow and a man's carefulness. Rowan arrived with a handful of herbs and a small knife and cut the binding free. "You should not come alone," he said softly, hands moving with a surgeon's grace, though his fingers were rough. "You should not be bait." "I am not bait," Lena said, trying to stand, but amazed at how her body wavered. "You were looking for trouble," he countered. Her heartbeat hammered a dozen quick rhythms. He bandaged her ankle with cloth that smelled of juniper and something sweet like dried apple. As he worked, his touch was practical and intimate. She felt the tension ease, but also felt the knowledge that the danger had been aimed at her, like a question that required an answer. The legal and social aftermath of attacks required procedure. An investigation was opened. Officer Ruiz filled forms, took statements, and collected physical evidence. Photographs of the snare and soil samples were logged. The town's elder convened a council to assess whether the trap had been set by a human antagonist or an animal hunter. The process was technical and specific, with chain of custody, forensics on the rope fibers, and witness statements cross-referenced. Lena watched as bureaucratic language tried and failed to hold the eerie edges of what had happened. The final confrontation arrived when a rival pack from the east tried to take advantage of the town's moment of instability. They moved at dusk, silent as a rumor, and a fight erupted that tested every rule Rowan had ever defended. Lena found herself in the center of a circle where the pack law and human law came into direct conflict. "You leave now," Rowan told the intruders, voice like a stored storm. "Leave, and we will not spill blood that can be avoided." The leader of the rival pack laughed, a cold sound. "You shelter human weakness," he sneered. Words slid into blows, and the battle became a dance of teeth and strategy. Lena saw Jonah shoved back hard enough to scrape his palms and heard Claire scream. Matthew tried to protect by carrying the elder away, and Isa Howard hid the ledger in her coat with trembling hands. The air smelled of iron and pine and fear. Then something happened that rewrote the rules. Rowan, facing down the rival Alpha, stepped into a ritual that neither of them expected. He did not kill. He shifted. Where once he had been tall and human, his body compressed and lengthened with the shock of sinew and hair and the terrible, beautiful geometry of a wolf. Rowan's eyes carried the moon like a claim that was lived rather than spoken. The rival pack recoiled, not because the transformation was monstrous, but because it was undeniably true. The change carried a sound that was like breaking and also like a hymn. The battle ended with partitions and bloodied pride. The town would not be unmarked after that night. The immediate physical consequences were complicated. Injuries were tended to, and the rival pack withdrew with a warning that tasted like promise. The next days were a blur of stitches, perfunctory console notes, and the weight of questions. Lena found herself in an intimate aftermath she had not expected. Rowan came to the bakery in human form the next morning and ordered coffee and bread with the awkwardness of someone who does not frequent domestic spaces. "You are learning what it costs," he said. "Claims ask for care. They ask for presence." "And what if I am not made for that?" Lena asked, her voice fragile as linen. He reached across the table and touched the back of her hand with the barest pressure, as if naming contract in human touch. "Then you will teach the pack something new about keeping," he said. The final scene of climax was the soft resolution that came with decision. Lena stood later on the river bridge where she had once thought the end of the world was a man leaving her. The river smelled like damp leaves and something new. Ben appeared, smaller than in memory, and offered apologies that had finally learned shape. "I thought being safe was what mattered," he said. "I thought choosing a life where I did not have to deal with ancient things was kinder." Lena looked at him with a clarity that came from walking through the fire and being singed but whole. "Safety is not always the same as courage," she answered. "You chose comfort. I chose truth, even when it hurt." He nodded and left as quietly as he had arrived. Rowan came then and stood at her side without announcement. "Are you afraid?" he asked. She tasted the salt of the river and the sugar of bread and something else, like the sweetness of being known. "Yes," she said simply, and also not. He reached and this time touched her necklace and the place where the band from the claiming had once warmed her skin. "Then come," he said. The aftermath moved into small domestic victories. Claire taught Lena how to suture soft fabric and laugh about inelegant stitches. Jonah brought over extra tools for the pack, and in a private moment admitted fear and friendship. Matthew helped file a joint statement with the town to ensure that future claims would include community.
Oversight. Officer Ruiz started to check in more often. Isaiah Howard wrote an article that was both reverent and practical, reminding the town of its history while urging caution. Elder Mara came to the bakery and told stories in a voice that smoothed edges and left the group feeling rooted. 1 month later, the town had stabilized into a new routine. The weather had cooled and nights were crisp. Lena had taken to walking at dawn with Jonah and talking quietly about small things. She still felt the bruise of the earlier rejection, but it had transformed into a different pain, a kind that told her she was alive. The pack met annually now with mindful ceremony and had appointed a council liaison who would communicate with town leaders. Rowan had learned to sit through weekly town meetings and to listen as much as to command. The town had learned to accept the strange alliance. Lena found that mornings tasted sweeter, and the bakery had a new line of pastries named after pack lore, because Noemi had a sense of humor and a business sense. She and Rowan had learned to negotiate space and time, exchanging casual texts that felt like the first tender stitches. She was not pretending everything was perfect, but she believed in the small repairs they were making. 3 months later, Lena stood under the same porch light where she had cried once before. The scene had changed. There were small invitations left on the table, simple things like a note to join a walk and a wrapped pine cone with a string. The town no longer whispered as much, and when they did, it was with a tone that suggested admiration rather than fear. The pack had enforced stricter patrols and a new code of conduct that blended civil protections and ritual respect. Lena's ankle had healed fully, and she had learned to braid rope for Jonah. She and Rowan had their first argument about public exposure when a blogger tried to sensationalize pack rituals. They fought with words that left them both weary, and then apologized with cups of tea in the early morning, a ritual of repair that felt honest and true. 6 months on, the world had settled into a shape neither of them expected. The town had a new leader in the council who was more open to hybrid solutions, and the bakery had begun offering mooncakes at Rowan's request. A child in school announced during a class presentation that the pack was part of our community now, and the applause that followed felt like a clean bandage. Lena's relationship with Ben had become a distance marked by occasional polite nods at the market. She and Rowan had created small domestic rituals, a weekly patrol where he taught her to listen to signs of the land, a monthly feast at Noemi where stories were swapped, and a private evening where they sat by the river and read aloud from old journals. Lena had learned that claiming was not a finishing line, but an invitation to a lifelong work of care. The necklace of her grandmother lingered between them like a bridge. There were cracks still. Some pack members never accepted the town's involvement and chose exile. Some townsfolk grumbled about customs. But new seeds were planted. Babies arrived, and the pack elders recorded births in the ledger with a notation that read, "Bound by care." Lena bore the knowledge that some nights would be long and there would be hard choices. She bore also the quiet certainty that being claimed had not erased her autonomy, but remade it into something that was shared. In a closing image, Lena watched the moon rise over Harrow's Bend, its light laying gentle tracks across the river, and felt at last that the painful rejection had been a crooked doorway into a kind of beginning she could not have written on her own. She had been marked and chosen, lost and found, and the future felt like a long field with a map in her pocket and a hand to hold. Before we close, tell me who is on your side now. Start your comment with Team Ben or Team Rowan and share one line about a time you were chosen or abandoned. Your answer helps shape the next chapter and reminds us all that stories are built from the pieces of our lives. If you want to follow this story, subscribe to the channel and stay for the next moon, where loyalties will be tested and healing will come in unexpected ways.